Welcome to this drum mixing workshop. I'm so pleased that you've joined me for this little tutorial. And what I want to do today is just take you through processing and mixing drums. When mixing drums, we've got some important considerations to take into account. What we're listening for is balance. Do all the drums sound even and equal and consistent? Do they need any EQ? EQ in terms of muddiness or boxiness, taking away from the tracks, or brightness and focus adding to the tracks. We want to assess the dynamics of the selected tracks. Do they need control with compression? Do they need a little bit of extra punch and snap? Do they need some added sustain? Well, we're going to tackle that with compression. Our drums need some sort of spatial aspect. So we're going to look at adding reverb, a couple of different types of reverbs that work really well with drums to put them into their own space. We're going to create a coherent stereo image for the drum kit by panning each element into its correct position according to the overheads. We're also going to go through a thorough drum preparation stage right before we get into any of the good stuff and playing around with effects. And in that stage, we're going to talk about phase and we're going to talk about drum spill and how to manage that by editing toms and by using tools such as multiband compressors and potentially gates. So without further ado, let's get on with this drum mixing workshop. We are going to be mixing real drums today. Drums are a tricky instrument to mix and record, but providing it's been recorded well and considerately, then mixing is made a little bit easier for us. The main reason it's an issue, or can be an issue, is because it's one instrument, but it's actually many instruments all bolted together into a drum kit and an overall drum sound. So every element of the kit has usually got a microphone on it, and that microphone will pick up all the drums in the drum kit, not just the drum you've got it pointed at. So that can bring some challenges, particularly tonal challenges, coming down to issues with phase and timing and all that good stuff. So we will no doubt talk about that when we get into the actual mixing. Now, I love mixing drums. Regardless of which genre of music I mix, it's the first thing that I usually mix because I feel that once you get the drum sound in a really good place, then everything else falls together that much easier. Now, to me, mixing drums is so important to the overall outcome of our mix in terms of our own satisfaction as a mixer, as well as the satisfaction of the listener who is consuming the song. And by that, I'm thinking about things like the emotion that the drums can impart. If we're mixing a rock song, the drums are heavy, loud, wide, beefy, then it's going to just add to that whole excitement of a rock mix. If it's something a little less energetic than that, something that's much more subdued, very low mood, then that too emanates from the drum mix. And the type of things that play into that are how we use EQ, how we use compression, and overall fader balance. Today we're working on a rock mix. We are at the static mix stage. I haven't mixed the rest of the instruments. They're all just fader balanced and panned at the moment. But what we need to do at this stage is recognise that these drums need a little bit of help, a little bit of energy, a little bit of power. That's what we're going to look at today. These tracks have been really well recorded. The drums are tuned, they've been edited, and they're ready to go. So we're at a stage now where we can just listen to the tracks that we've been given and decide how we want these drums to sound. A good way to consider how you want the drums to sound is to use reference tracks. Listen to the song all the way through. Does it bring to mind any song you already know, a commercial song that you already know that you might draw upon for some inspiration with regard to tone and balance, loudness and energy? Once you've decided the sort of area that you're going to head towards with these drums, then we can get on and start mixing. And the first part of mixing drums is the preparation stage. Now, there's no right or wrong way to mix drums. So the purpose of this drum mixing workshop is just to guide you, really, give you some pointers and some useful techniques that you can store away in your mixing toolbox to pull out whenever you feel the need. As I've already mentioned, with well-recorded drums, then our mixing goal is much easier to complete. So the mix really is only going to be as good as the quality of the recorded tracks. So if this is something that you do for yourself, if you record drums yourself, then it's well worth the time and effort investing in recording techniques, practicing, trial and error, using different microphones, different placements, and learn how to capture a great sounding drum recording. So let's talk about preparing drums for mixing. Before we do that, let's play these drums, this static mix in fact, so you can hear roughly what's going on before we start adding processing to these tracks. Okay, so that's giving you a great idea on the instrumentation and the style of rock music that we're dealing with today. So I'll just repeat that this is just a static mix. There's very little processing going on here at the moment. Nothing in the way of effects, nothing in the way of EQ, maybe a little bit, and dynamic control as well. So it's all to do. In this workshop, I'm not going to be mixing the rest of the instrumentation. All we're concentrating on today are drums. But just from that brief run through to the intro, the verse and into the chorus, you can hear that the guitars have got great potential to sound great. We've got some synths that are coming in to add interest. Vocals are well recorded, played a little bit of the vocals. But the drums just sounding a little bit sort of weak and lackluster. And what's happening in the chorus there was the snare started to get very loud. And that's typical because we've not got any form of compression happening whatsoever here. There's also, as I said, no EQ. So the low end isn't quite right. The bass and the drums aren't locking together. There's just a bit too much going on and it's all sounding a bit sort of flabby, really. So that's what we're going to be listening to and looking at more closely as we progress through this drum mixing workshop. So what we've got here, if we take a look, we've got all our drum tracks from a kick in to a stereo room. So there's quite a number of drum tracks here. And what's slightly different to the norm with regard to this set of drums, but it's by no means not unseen, and that is that the toms are mic'd with two mics, one on the top and one on the bottom, and there are 3 toms in total in this drum kit. So that's something we need to bear in mind, and I'll discuss some extra considerations you may need to take when you're working with as many microphones as we are today on this drum kit. We've got a drum bus here at the very left-hand side of the screen here, but we've got 2 kicks, a kick in and a kick out. If you don't know what that means, kick in is where the mic is actually inside the bass drum. Kick out means that the microphone is on the outside of the bass drum, and that can be at differing lengths. Then we've got 2 snare mics here. We've got an SM57 microphone and an AKG microphone. So 2 quite different sounding microphones. So we'll audition those and decide what we're going to do with those in a little bit. And then we've got all our toms. So we've got a rack up and a rack down. The up and down terminology, up means it's on the top, down means it's underneath, marking the bottom skin if the tom has a bottom skin. So then we have a floor 1 up and down and a floor 2 up and down. Then we come on to the metalwork. So the hi-hat, we've got some stereo overheads, we've got a mono room, and we've got a stereo room. So everything there is pretty typical, what you would see, other than really the bottom mics on the toms. So with preparation, the first thing to do is consider whether you want to add any auxiliary tracks here to group multiple microphones together. I've already done that here with the toms with these green tracks. These are auxiliary buses, and I've bussed rack up and rack down to rack tom bus, and similarly floor 1 up and floor 1 down I've racked to floor tom 1 bus, and the same idea with the floor 2. And the idea of that is that we can process the combined sound of the up and down microphones on the one auxiliary track. With an auxiliary, we're summing together one or more tracks, feeding them all, funneling them all through that one new auxiliary track that we've created. Now you can do the same thing. We've got the kick in and the kick out, and we've got 2 snare mics. Kick in, kick out, we could quite easily decide to route those to an auxiliary bus so that we can do the same thing. We can process the kick sound as a whole, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to blend the in and out microphones to create our overall kick sound. So it stands to reason then that it makes sense then to process that sound as one element through an auxiliary track. You don't have to do that, however. You can keep them all individual. And using an auxiliary does make sense in terms of session organisation. You can then keep the faders where you've set them here on the individual tracks, and you can use the auxiliary fader to globally increase or decrease the sound of that element. Another area where you may do this is where you've been given a stereo recording of the overheads, but you may have been given an overhead left and an overhead right as 2 mono tracks. And there would be a great example of where you could bus the 2 individual tracks to an auxiliary bus, call it overheads, and you could do the same thing there and process the overheads on the auxiliary track. So that's the workflow for using auxiliary tracks. Today, in this session, I'm going to do a bit of both so that I cater for everybody. So I'm using auxiliary tracks on the toms, and I'm going to keep the kicks and the snares separate. Continuing with the workflow theme, all these drum tracks are routed to a drum bus, and the drum bus is here. So let me just explain what I'm doing here with this routing. All the drums, as I've said, are being routed through this drum bus auxiliary. There's no processing on this, and it's at unity gain. So nothing's happening here. The signals are just travelling through this auxiliary track. This auxiliary track is routed to a group bus. And if you've done any sort of mixing before, this is something you will have seen. Group buses or groups. And these would be called drums, bass, guitars, keyboards, vocals, etc. So why have I got 2 drum buses, you may be asking? That's a very good question. This drum bus here on the left-hand side, I rarely touch, but it's there just in case I need to bring down the level of all the drums before they reach the drum and bass bus. That's the difference. This group bus is actually a drum and bass bus, and this group bus does have processing on it, as do all of my instrument buses. And if I open them up here, it might make a little bit more sense. But I've just hidden them really for clarity for this workshop. But you can see I've got a group bus for drum and bass, I've got a group bus for guitars, same thing, a group bus for keys, group bus for vocals, and a group bus for the effects. I don't want you to get too bogged down in what's going on there in this workshop, otherwise it's just going to go on for hours. But the principle is that on these main instrument group buses, I do have some gentle processing. And the processing on these group buses affects the entire group. So on each of these groups, I have my preferred processing. Processing on group buses like this usually means that you don't have to work quite so hard to get the sounds that you're looking for on the individual tracks. All the group buses are then fed to my mix bus, which is here. Same principle again here, where I like a handful of plugins to just bring a little bit of character, width, depth to my entire mix. So as we're working through these individual drum tracks, you need to know and remember that they are all going through this drum and bass bus, where we've got some processing happening here, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then from this group bus, they're being routed to the mix bus here, which again has its own set of processing going on. And then at the other end of the session here, I've got a selection of effects that we can use on the drums to really enhance the overall sound and have them sounding just larger than life. Today as well, we're going to talk about parallel processing on drums. So I've got two parallel tracks here, a parallel drum track here and a parallel distortion track. So we'll be looking at using those later as well. I'm using a drum and bass bus, but you don't need to do that. You can have individual group buses for your drums and for your bass guitar. The reason I've got the two bus together here is that there's usually only one or two bass tracks. Oftentimes there is only one. To route that to an auxiliary seems a little bit overkill. But also the drums and bass have to work together. They have to move with each other and move in term. What I'm talking about there is when we've got compression on this bus. We want the kick and bass to be locked together. And sometimes by routing the two together into a bus like this and putting a compressor across them both, that can add to that sense of glue and cohesion. So it's up to you. You can copy literally what I'm doing here, or you can go down the separate bus route. But the thing to remember is that when routing to the instrument buses, you're actually routing from the output of the track and not from the sends here. So I'm talking about this section here, the input-output section, and not using a send, an auxiliary send. What you're doing is you're actually completely rerouting the entire track through the bus, not taking a feed from it using an auxiliary send, a copy of it. You're actually routing the entire track to your group bus. I'm going to mute the other instrument groups, and we're just going to concentrate on the drums. Later on in the workshop, I may very well bring in the bass guitar, because that is a consideration to make, a big consideration to make when you're mixing drums. If I play these drums now, you will see audio signal here in the drum and bass bus, and you'll also see signal here at the mix bus. And by muting the group bus there, that's a test to make sure that you've got all your drums routed to the correct place. If when I muted it, we'd heard a rogue drum still playing, then we know we've missed one somewhere. We need to go back and reroute it. So this method that I'm talking about of routing tracks, individual tracks through group buses and then processing the combined audio on the buses is referred to as top-down mixing. And I generally do a little bit of both. I will start a mix with some gentle processing on the mix bus and on the group buses, and then go into the individual tracks to work on them. So with the drums in mind, the processing that I've got on this drum bus is I've got this plugin here which emulates the sound of transformers. The next plugin I'm using is a Pultec, and the idea here is you can see I've already got EQ dialed in. I haven't done anything to the individual tracks, But this is the opening state of this plugin for me. It will always have a boost of 2 on the 10K frequency and on the 60 Hertz frequency. So I'll play the drums and then I'll bypass this plugin and you can hear for yourself how great it is on a drum bus. Okay, adds a little bit of thump, a little bit of low end, and a tiny bit of high end to the cymbals. And then the next one is a compressor. The compressor I'm using at the moment on this drum and bass bus is this Shadow Hills. It's quite a complicated looking plugin, but all you need to know is that we have a ratio of 4:1, we have an attack setting of 30 milliseconds, and we have a recovery time of 0.1 or 100 milliseconds. So it's really great at just increasing the energy soundstage. It's subtle. If you're new to mixing, you may not be able to hear that so obviously, but listening to this on good monitors or headphones, if you can, you'll really hear all these little tiny differences. And these little tiny differences all add up to a great sounding mix at the end of the day. So the goal is to kind of keep restraint and not go too hard in these initial stages of mixing drums. There's a little bit of stereo width being added here on this plugin. It's kind of a unique thing to this plugin, so it's just making the drums sound a touch wider. Then is just a EQ plugin where I'm doing a steep roll-off of 21 Hertz. This can really help free up headroom. 21 Hertz is not really something that you hear, more something that you feel, but its energy is so large and has such a great effect on the way compressors work that just by doing that cut across all of your group buses on every single instrument group bus, it just allows the speakers a little bit more freedom to move more efficiently with the low-end frequencies in your mix. So this is something that I will choose to do on a song-by-song basis. Okay, so let's play through these drums. What I'll do is bypass all those plugins and then bring them back again. So hopefully you heard that. That is the group bus processing for the drums and bass group, and it's adding just a little bit of extra dimension, a little bit of extra weight and brightness to our dry drum tracks. For completeness, let's do the same thing with the mix bus processing. So much the same thing there. The processing on the mix bus is also adding to that sense of space around the drums. And what you're hearing there is the Red 17, the SPL Iron, the ATR 102 tape machine, followed by the API EQ. Because the drums are the foundation of the mix, it's important that we get the level of the drums in a good spot to continue mixing in the remaining instruments, the bass, guitars, the keyboards, the vocals. So I just have one number that I like to get close to when mixing drums. that I know will leave me with enough headroom for processing and for sending away for mastering at the end of the mix if I needed to do that. So what I want you to notice is the fader positions that all of these tracks are currently set at in this so-called static mix. You'll see that they're all set at -4 dB on the faders. Remember, the green tracks are auxiliaries, so they're set at unity. So kind of hop your eyes over those and you'll see that the actual individual tracks are all sitting at the same point, and that's -4. And the reason that I've done that is because, first of all, I want to analyse what the recording sounds like. How have they been recorded? And this gives me a good idea. If I can set all the faders to the same point, i.e. -4 in this instance, and the mix coming back is pretty well balanced as it is, as you can hear, then I know that I'm gonna have a lot less work to do. And it also gives me confidence that the recording has been well considered and is of good quality. If we switch over to this view, I just want to draw your attention to the actual waveforms. This is something that I do at the start of every mix. Every drum mix is just look at the waveforms to make an assessment of how loudly these tracks have been recorded. And these have been recorded quite conservatively, which is good. And I can look at these and know that none of them are going to give me any problems in terms of being too loud or too quiet. And also, because all the drums set at the same fader level, it sounds so balanced already, I'm not overly concerned with any tracks that might look quiet in sections like here, because I can see that in the main sections, the choruses and the verses, there's plenty of level. The toms have already been edited, so what that means is that all the bleed or spill from all the other microphones has already been edited out for us. And what that can mean, or the benefit of that, is that our drums can sound much tighter, drier, more controlled, more focused. By keeping the bleed in, you're just likely going to end up with a drum sound that's going to be more on the roomier side than one that is quite so tight and focused. And that is all dependent on the mic positioning and the way that they've been recorded and played. To be on the safe side, I generally do edit out the spill on the tom mics. The only place I haven't edited out the spill is in this breakdown section. Because they're being played constantly. If we take a look at this rack tom here, in this alternative playlist, I can show you the track before it was edited. So you can see all of this bleed. And once it's edited out, you can see that there are only a couple of tom hits there. So when you're faced with that, you just basically have to go through and pull out each of the tom hits. And it's really quite a simple process. It's just finding the tom hit. In Pro Tools, you can tab to transient, and you can just put a cut in place on the front edge of the tom hit. Take a listen to it. So there's a cymbal crash and a snare hit. We don't really want that, so do another cut there. Then you go to the next tom hit, tab to transient, till you get to the leading edge of the next tom hit on that track. Put in another cut, zoom out, highlight that section, cut it out, zoom back in and go back to the first tom hit and put a nice fade on it, and then get rid of what you don't need at the front edge of it like that. Just delete and go to the front edge, just pull it back a little bit and put a little bit of a fade there like that. Hope that makes sense. So that's how you clean up toms. What you get then is this. So I hope that explains how to edit toms. When you see tom tracks that look like this with lots of spill in it, go through each tom track, find each tom hit, do a cut either side of it, and just make sure you don't chop off the transient, the leading hit, and then place a second cut in the tail of the tom. We don't want to lose too much of the sustain of the tom if you can help it, but you certainly want to try and cut before the cymbal crash. There's usually a cymbal crash that follows a tom hit. So you just want to place a cut there and do a nice fade out and work through each individual tom track like that, rack toms and the floor toms, to isolate each tom hit, make it sound nice and clean and tight. And the end result, you'll just get a cleaner sounding drum mix. The kick and snare will be much more focused. So back to this, the preparation of our drum mix. We've cleaned up the toms and now we're going to set up a static mix. We've established how well the tracks have been recorded, how considered they've been recorded, in that we can bring them all up to the same fader level and they sound pretty balanced already. So a lot of work has been done for us. This is something to bear in mind because this is going to help with what the intention for the drum sound was. When it's so well balanced like that, when all the faders are set at the same level, then that's been considered when it was being laid down to tape or to digital DAW land anyway. So it just gives you a clue on how the band may want the drums to sound.